Good evening. They want me to put in my code to open my phone. They do that every once in a while. It says, for added security. So, yeah, I'm going to get in contact with my wife here so that, all right, that's not what I wanted, but I think that'll work. And no, we don't want that on Bluetooth. We want that on speaker. Well, good evening and welcome to our Friday night Bible study for Friday, August the 29th, 2025. This will be the last one in August, obviously. And this is also, I'm told, the Labor Day weekend beginning. Well, let's see. Today's 29th, so tomorrow's the 30th, Sunday's the 31st, so Monday will be the first Monday in September. So this coming Monday is Labor Day, the earliest Labor Day ever comes, obviously. Hello, are you there?
Yeah.
Okay, my wife is here and with us. Now, I wanted to say a thing or two about some of the music that we had at the beginning, if you happen to hear it. The very first song we played was I've Found a Friend. I have a recording of that from more than 40 years ago that I got during morning worship at a post-secondary school that I attended in Colorado. And we lived in faculty homes. The family that we lived with, the wife was the assistant administrator of the nursing home that was kind of the money maker for the institution. And her husband was the maintenance supervisor for said nursing home. And he would lead out in morning worship while his wife was fixing breakfast. And one of the things that we would do is we would sing something that got picked out of the hymnal a cappella. So the recording is of a bunch of sometimes still sleepy young men singing that hymn rather slowly in parts. Didn't think about it much at the time. I got the recording just because I was recording stuff and I thought it might be nice to have. I'm not even sure if I could lay hands on that tape right away. I might still have it. But the thing is, what struck me about that was many years later, I ran across that lady on Facebook. And she had changed her lifestyle quite a bit and was actually a performer in a musical group doing, I think she performed Christian country. But that means that still way back then she had musical skills and she had to stand in there fixing breakfast listening to that. Well, just yeah, just try to imagine that, somebody who's a talented and capable musician listening to a bunch of amateur guys, some of us trying to sing in parts very slowly, that particular hymn. Anyway, the piece that you heard at the end, you probably didn't recognize. It's not from a hymnal, it's from a video game. We got the game way back in the mid 80s. Um, and I heard that particular melody. It was played when you were in a town, and it struck me as odd. Well, what's odd about it is that the tonic is major and the dominant is major, but at least some of the time the subdominant or the four chord is minor. Now that's not as unusual as you might think. When you play something in a minor key, then the tonic is minor and the subdominant or four chord is minor, but the dominant is major. It's just the tonic being major and the subdominant being minor that strikes us as odd. And I heard it, and I said, I got to fix that. Well, you can't fix it until you know how it's done. So in order to pick it out, I couldn't just do it off the game. So I actually made a cassette recording of a bunch of the music out of the game and then took that to the piano and sat down and picked it out. Well, by the time I figured out what they were doing and what it was, it now sounded normal and natural to me. And when I did try to fix it, I didn't come up with anything that I thought was any good. But that's how I learned that music.
Question.
All right, question away.
Anything that made sense?
What are you saying?
Did you just say anything that made sense?
Well, if you have some education in music and you know what it means when we say tonic, dominant, and subdominant, yeah. Otherwise, no, it probably didn't make any sense.
All right, I'll take your word for that.
I probably don't have as much knowledge as I ought to, considering that I minored in music for my bachelor's degree. But yeah, I have a smattering of musical knowledge. Um, in the news this week, very early in the week, we mentioned several weeks ago the shooting incident in Georgia on the campus of a university that's associated with the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. And we concluded that the target was, in fact, the CDC, which is still in the news and still controversial. However, we did have another live shooting thing show up, and so I went to look at it, and it was in a major university, a state-sponsored university in our state. And so I watched some of the coverage and paid attention. Well, it turns out there was no shooter. Police found no evidence that any gunshots were fired. They never found a shooter. They detained some people, but they never arrested them. And in the end, after they got the campus cleared, they determined that the call was a hoax. And that's not entirely surprising because it had been happening at a number of college campuses. Apparently, on colleges things tend to go and students pick up from one another things and copycat stuff. And a number of universities have had these hoax shooting incidents called in. When I was in college, one week they had a bomb threat called in during the church service, and they canceled the church service and evacuated the church. That was a hoax, and I don't know if they ever figured out who it was. Back then, they didn't have the kind of technology we have today. Today, they're going to find out where the call came from, and there's a pretty good chance they'll find out who it is. Well, that got me to thinking, so I looked it up. What's the penalty in our state for falsely reporting an incident? Well, normally, falsely reporting an incident is a Class A misdemeanor. That means it's the most serious misdemeanor before you get into felony territory. But given one of 5 conditions, it can be considered a Class D felony. So it can cross over from misdemeanor into felony territory, which is considerably more serious. The penalty for a Class A misdemeanor ranges up to 1 year in prison and fines. However, when you get to the Class D felony, the penalty is a maximum of 6 years in prison plus fines and so forth. Now, I also looked up, well, what is it that makes it a felony instead of a misdemeanor? And there's a 5-item test for that. First item is you're reporting a capital crime or one of the 3 top-level felonies. In our states, that's classes B, A, and Y. Those are the top 3 felonies. So if you report one of those falsely, then it becomes a felony. The next item is if you report an incident in order to cover up your own criminal activity. The third item is it becomes a felony if, because you reported this incident, somebody gets arrested. Well, as I said, in this case, some people were detained, but they were not arrested. The police determined pretty quickly that they were not an issue and let them go after they were detained. The fourth item is if somebody is physically injured as a result of your hoax call. In this case, we had no reports that anybody was injured, so that wouldn't apply. However, the last side, and the one I think is the easiest threshold to overcome, and that is a law enforcement agency spent over $500 investigating your false report. Well, in this case, they had officers from at least 4 departments: the University Police Department, the police department from the city the university was located in, the sheriff's department for the county it's located in, the state police, and the officers from another city police department assisted in the response. I never did get a count, but I have an idea there were upwards of 50 police cars on that campus. Now, let's just assume that an officer earns $25 an hour, the average officer. I mean, there's sergeants are going to make more than corporals and so forth, but so let's just imagine an average of about $25 per officer. Well, all it takes is 20 officer hours, and there's your $500 right there. Well, I know they had more than 20 officers on site, I'm sure of that. And it took them several hours because they had to go through all the buildings in question and clear each building room by room. So that took a lot of hours. So the chances are pretty good that if they find out who made this hoax call, that they could end up facing a felony charge of falsely reporting an incident. And so that's what's going on these days. There's lots of other news that we kind of ignore because it's so controversial and emotional in its content and ridiculous, etc., etc. So I put down in our subtitle that we might finish the book of 2 Chronicles tonight. Might even get into Ezra. I'm not going to hazard an opinion on that at this point, but let's go ahead and bow our heads and we'll get started. Our Father in heaven, we thank you that you have given us your blessing. We're thankful that we've made it through another week. We're thankful that we have the written word and we understand that it's there to lead us to the living word. And so we thank you for the living word, your Son Jesus, who came to show us who you were, what you were like, and how we might come to you and find eternal life. So as we look at the word tonight, we want to find you, we want to understand you better, and we want the Holy Spirit to lead us to a proper understanding of what we read. So we request that blessing in the name of Jesus at this time. Amen. So, get the right screen up here. And we finished off with 2 Chronicles chapter 30, and that was the one that told us about the big month-late Passover festival that Hezekiah led out in just after he became king. His grandfather was Josiah, but his father was Amon, and Amon had a tendency to want to run his finger in the Creator's eye and be obstinate, and he is recorded both in Kings and in Chronicles as a wicked king. He's the one who met the king of Assyria in Damascus, saw an altar there and had it rebuilt and put up. I think he was the one. If not, it was Manasseh, who we're about to get to. But anyway, so that was where we were. And so there was that big Passover, and they actually invited people from the northern kingdom. The northern kingdom is on its last legs at this point, but some of the people did actually respect the Creator, Yahweh, and did come to Jerusalem to celebrate this Passover at Hezekiah's invitation. So now we read in chapter 31, When the festival ended, the Israelites who attended went to all the towns of Judah, Benjamin, Ephraim, and Manasseh, and they smashed all the sacred pillars, cut down the Asherah poles, and removed the pagan shrines and altars. After this, the Israelites returned to their own towns and homes. Hezekiah then organized, now notice the people did that, not the king. When we get to Josiah, Josiah himself went out into the northern kingdom, which was actually no longer a kingdom, it was now Assyrian territory. But he went there and he desecrated some of the pagan shrines, including the altars for the golden calves, at least at Bethel. I don't know if he got as far north as Dan, but at least at Bethel. Hezekiah then organized the priests and Levites into divisions to offer the burnt offerings and peace offerings, and to worship and give thanks and praise to the Lord at the gates of the temple. The king also made a personal contribution of animals for the daily, morning, and evening burnt offerings, the weekly Sabbath festivals, the monthly new moon festivals, and the annual festivals as prescribed in the law of the Lord. In addition, he required the people in Jerusalem to bring a portion of their goods to the priests and Levites so they could devote themselves fully to the law of the Lord. And here is where we get the idea of the congregation supporting the clergy, because this is something that Hezekiah set up. It had been set up previously, but Hezekiah kind of reinstates it. We also get this idea of the king personally contributing animals. And that gets repeated when we get to the book of Ezekiel, the last chapters. We'll read about the prince, or the king, and how he would be involved in worship in the new temple that Ezekiel describes. When the people of Israel heard these requirements, they responded generously by bringing the first share of their grain, new wine, olive oil, honey, and all the produce of their fields. They brought a large quantity, a tithe of all they produced. The people who had moved to Judah from Israel, and the people of Judah themselves, brought in the tithes of their cattle, sheep, and goats, and a tithe of the things that had been dedicated to the Lord their God, and they piled them up in great heaps. They began piling them up in late spring, and the heaps continued to grow until early autumn. Now, a footnote there will tell us the exact dates as given in the Hebrew, and then based on the Hebrew lunar calendar, what part of the year that would be in. And of course, I don't think we can accurately place a lot of these Hebrew dates, because the calendar was determined by the priest in real time. So it wasn't something, like today, we can put the Gregorian calendar, which is the one that we use both forward and backwards in time, completely accurately, because there's a whole formula for how that works. They didn't do that. The priest decided in real time when to add a 13th month to keep the months aligned with the year. When Hezekiah and his officials came and saw these huge piles, they thanked the Lord and his people Israel. "Where did all this come from?" Hezekiah asked the priests and Levites. And Azariah, the high priest from the family of Zadok, replied, "Since the people began bringing their gifts to the Lord's temple, we have had enough to eat and plenty to spare. The Lord has blessed his people, and all this is left over." Hezekiah ordered that storerooms be prepared in the temple of the Lord. Well, storerooms had been there before, but now they're setting it up again. Storerooms, I believe, were actually set up in the rooms that were attached to the north and south walls of the temple proper. And the descriptions we have is that each tier of rooms was a little bit wider than the tier below it, so they actually got wider as they went up. And these storerooms then will be there in the rebuilt temple, and they'll become an issue that we'll read about in the book of Nehemiah when we get there. At any rate, Hezekiah ordered that storerooms be prepared in the temple of the Lord, and when this was done, the people faithfully brought all the gifts, tithes, and other items dedicated for use in the temple. Conaniah the Levite was put in charge, assisted by his brother Shimei. The supervisors under them were Jehiel, Azaziah, Nahath, Asahel, Jeremoth, Jozabad, Eliel, Ismachiah, Mahath, and Benaiah. These appointments were made by King Hezekiah and Azariah, the chief official, in the temple of God. So the priests did the actual religious functions, and then there were Levites who did not descend directly from the line of the priests, who served in other management, logistical, and administrative functions to keep the temple operating. Korah, son of Imnah the Levite, who was the gatekeeper at the east gate, was put in charge of distributing the voluntary offerings given to God, the gifts and the things that had been dedicated to the Lord. His faithful assistants were Eden, Meniamim, Jeshua, Shemaiah, Amariah, and Shechaniah. They distributed the gifts among the families of priests in their towns by their divisions, dividing the gifts fairly among old and young alike. They distributed the gifts to all males 3 years old or older, regardless of their place in the genealogical records. The distribution, and there's an indication, now we know that in the days of Ezra and Nehemiah, genealogical records became exceptionally important, but they existed before then, otherwise they wouldn't have been able to give all those records that we have in the scriptures that are genealogical records. The Jews always considered them important. They just became more critical in the days of Ezra and Nehemiah. At any rate, the distribution went to all who would come to the Lord's temple to perform their daily duties according to their divisions. That would include the musicians. They distributed gifts to the priests who were listed by their families in the genealogical records, and to the Levites 20 years old or older who were listed according to their jobs and their divisions. And 20 years was the age of majority among the priests when a priest would begin functioning in the temple and doing official religious duties. Food allotments were also given to the families of all those listed in the genealogical records, including their little babies, wives, sons, and daughters, for they had all been faithful in purifying themselves. As for the priests, the descendants of Aaron, who were living in the open villages around the towns, men were appointed by name to distribute portions to every male among the priests and to all the Levites listed in the genealogical records. In this way, King Hezekiah handled the distribution throughout all Judah, doing what was pleasing and good in the sight of Yahweh his God. In all that he did in the service of the temple of God, and in his efforts to follow God's laws and commands, Hezekiah sought his God wholeheartedly. As a result, he was very successful. Now, we did a sermon presentation a year or so ago about the stories that we're about to come across here, the stories of the attack by Sennacherib of Assyria. And we pointed out then that Hezekiah's success and influence was considerably less than some of the earlier Judean kings. He controlled less territory, so he had less wealth. But still, he gets all this attention in the Old Testament. And that has to do with both Ezra and Nehemiah and the prophet's perception that he was particularly faithful to the Creator. So they built that part of the story up. Now, here's our footnote. It says, in the 3rd month until the 7th month. The 3rd month of the ancient Hebrew lunar calendar usually occurs within the months of May and June, and the 7th month usually occurs within September and October. And in fact, the names that we use today for the months in English, starting with September, July and August are based on Roman emperors. However, September, S-E-P-T, the prefix meaning 7, October, O-C-T, the prefix meaning 8, November, N-O-V, the prefix meaning 9, and then December, D-E-C, the prefix meaning 10. So 7, 8, 9, and 10 are literally named in our months, except we observe them as 9, 10, 11, and 12 months. So the number of the month doesn't match the name of the month. And that's because the names are more closely related to the Hebrew calendar. Just interesting little note there. Chapter 32. Assyria invades Judah. Now here's the story of Sennacherib. And this whole thing is going to take just this one chapter. I think the chapter is a little bit longer. But you may recall that in Kings and in Isaiah, this story takes several chapters. 2 or 3 anyway. After Hezekiah had faithfully carried out this work, King Sennacherib of Assyria invaded Judah. He laid siege to the fortified towns, giving orders for his army to break through their walls. When Hezekiah realized that Sennacherib also intended to attack Jerusalem, he consulted with his officials and military advisors, and they decided to stop the flow of the springs outside the city. They organized a huge work crew to stop the flow of the springs, cutting off the brook that ran through the fields. For they said, "Why should the kings of Assyria come here and find plenty of water?" So this is a tactical decision that they're making. This is part of their strategy. How are we going to defend ourselves? Well, one of the things we think we ought to do is make sure we have all the water and that the attacking army doesn't have ready access to our water. And so they do this. Now, that's interesting because now I'm going to take you to a chapter in the book of Isaiah. Now, we have read out of this before when we were reading the book of Kings, because we were talking about some of the people named at the end of this chapter. And if I've got it right, the chapter I want is chapter 23. No, not chapter 23. Is it chapter 22? Yes, I think it's chapter 22. And chapter 22, I won't read the whole chapter, but it starts out, an oracle concerning the valley of vision. What troubles you now that you have gone up on the roofs, O town full of commotion, O city of tumult and revelry? Your slain were not killed by the sword, nor did they die in battle. All your leaders have fled together. They have been captured without using the bow. All you who were caught were taken prisoner together, having fled while the enemy was still far away. Therefore I said, turn away from me, let me weep bitterly, and so on and so forth. So it continues and it talks about the valley of vision. Let's see, how about we pick up at verse 8. The defenses of Judah are stripped away. And you looked in that day to the weapons in the palace of the forest. You saw that the city of David had many breaches in its defenses. You stored up water in the lower pool. You counted the buildings in Jerusalem and tore down houses to strengthen the wall. You built a reservoir between the two walls for the water of the old pool. Now, this is not a direct link necessarily, but I think it is a link because of who's involved to this bit about changing the flow of water to keep the water inside the city. They are building a reservoir here, and they are putting in the water into those reservoirs. So they're storing up water in the lower pool. Well, they're probably getting that from the springs outside the city. So I think that this is actually a reference to this incident as described here. Now let's read on. But you did not look to the one, and the NIV capitalizes one there, who made it, or have regard for the one, again capitalized, who planned it long ago. Yahweh, the Lord Almighty, called you on that day to weep and to wail. to tear out your hair and put on sackcloth. But see, there's joy and revelry, slaughtering of cattle and killing of sheep, eating of meat and drinking of wine. Let us eat and drink, you say, for tomorrow we die. Yeah, that's a pretty fatalistic viewpoint. And that appears to be consistent with what's being described here when Jerusalem is under threat by Sennacherib, the Assyrians. And the Assyrians had Assyrians.
Your last meal comes from?
Say that again. You didn't come in until I got the last few words.
Is this where you get the idea of getting your last meal comes in? You get whatever you want.
Well, it could be. But it seems that
There's a lot of things that we do today or say today, when you trace it back, you can find that it was in the Bible.
yeah. And that's a very, very clear reference. Let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we die, is right out of the Bible. Yes. Anyway, so they're facing this threat. As I say, it hasn't said that here because it's not recovering the northern towns, the northern kingdom, but we know from the books of Kings that it was during Hezekiah's reign that Sennacherib of Assyria defeated Samaria, took their king away captive, and then moved the people out of the land and put other people in the land. That happened at this point. So the northern kingdom has now been defeated, and the people of Jerusalem are seeing that this same army is headed their way, and this is their response. So, reading on. The Lord Almighty has revealed this in my hearing. Till your dying day, this sin will not be atoned for, says Yahweh, the Lord Almighty. This is what Yahweh, the Lord Almighty, says. Go, say to this steward, to Shebna, who is in charge of the palace, what are you doing here, and who gave you permission to cut out a grave for yourself here, hewing your grave on the height and chiseling your resting place in the rock? Beware, the Lord is about to take firm hold of you and hurl you away, O you mighty man. He will roll you up tightly like a ball and throw you into a large country. There you will die, and there your splendid chariots will remain, you disgrace to your master's house. I will depose you from your office, and you will be ousted from your position. And then there's that non-poetic passage after that about Eliakim, son of Hilkiah, taking Shebna's place. Shebna was the secretary. I think we'll find him mentioned here. I know he's mentioned in Kings. Anyway, so that is Isaiah's viewpoint about what we're reading here. They did all these things, but apparently God didn't entirely agree with what they were doing. Then Hezekiah worked hard at repairing all the broken sections of the wall, erecting towers and constructing a second wall outside the first. He also reinforced the supporting terraces in the city of David and manufactured large numbers of weapons and shields. He appointed military officers over the people and assembled them before him in the square at the city gate. Then Hezekiah encouraged them by saying, "Be strong and courageous. Don't be afraid or discouraged because of the king of Assyria or his mighty army, for there is a power far greater on our side. He may have a great army, but they are merely men. We have the Lord our God to help us and to fight our battles for us." Hezekiah's words greatly encouraged the people. Now, we didn't read this in the book of Kings, so when we read the speech of Sennacherib's field commander when he comes to taunt the people of Jerusalem, he apparently got word of this speech that Hezekiah made, and it's why he said what he said. In Kings, it's not as clear where that comes from, but here now we see, yes, the king did in fact make such a speech, and now the king of Assyria is trying to take that speech and turn it against the king and his people. While King Sennacherib of Assyria was still besieging the town of Lachish, he sent his officers to Jerusalem with this message for Hezekiah and all the people of the city. This is what King Sennacherib of Assyria says. What are you trusting in that makes you think you can survive my siege of Jerusalem? Hezekiah has said, the Lord our God will rescue us from the king of Assyria. Surely Hezekiah is misleading you, sentencing you to death by famine and thirst. Yeah, that's what abusers very often do. They try to blame somebody else for their own deeds. So they attack your city, they cut you off from your supplies of food and water, and when you're hungry and thirsty, they say, well, see, it's his fault. It's not my fault, it's his fault. And that's what he's doing here. Surely Hezekiah is misleading you, sentencing you to death by famine and thirst. Well, it's not Hezekiah sentencing them to death, it's Sennacherib himself, killing everybody he has to in order to get what he wants.
Yeah.
Try again. I was talking so it didn't come across.
I'm only hitting you to help you.
Right, yeah, exactly. Don't you realize that Hezekiah is the very person who destroyed all the Lord's shrines and altars? He commanded Judah and Jerusalem to worship only at the altar at the temple and to offer sacrifices on it alone. And we talked about this when we read this in the books of Kings, that Sennacherib clearly misunderstood the religion that had been passed down from the days of Moses, where the record very specifically says that there should be one place for worship at the city that God would choose amongst the cities of Israel. And so Hezekiah is doing what it says in the book he should do. And Sennacherib takes that as, well, he's thumbed his nose at God by cutting down all his shrines, so what makes him think God's going to help him? Surely you must realize what I and the other kings of Assyria before me have done to all the people of the earth. Were any of the gods of those nations able to rescue their people from my power? Well, no, the gods of those nations weren't gods at all. They were figments of the people's imagination and images made to represent those figments of imagination. And your imagination can't do anything to save you, except the placebo effect, okay? What makes you think your God can rescue you from me? Well, the God of Israel, if in fact they worship the Creator, had superhuman power because he's the creator, not a creature. And so the creature has no power compared to the creator. And yet he's spewing forth these words because he doesn't get that distinction. He doesn't understand it. He doesn't believe in Yahweh as the creator. The Yahweh is just the God of Israel, like all these other imaginary gods are the gods of the lands of the people who imagine them. What makes you think your God can rescue you from me? Don't let Hezekiah deceive you. Don't let him fool you like this. I say it again, no God of any nation or kingdom has ever yet been able to rescue his people from me or my ancestors. How much less will your God rescue you from my power? And Sennacherib's officers further mocked the Lord God and his servant Hezekiah, heaping insult upon insult. The king also sent letters scorning Yahweh, the God of Israel. He wrote, just as the gods of all the other nations failed to rescue their people from my power, so the God of Hezekiah will also fail. There's a place in the Bible where somebody says, he who's dressing for battle shouldn't boast like someone who's come back. Because what if he doesn't come back? The Assyrian officials who brought the letter shouted this in Hebrew to the people gathered on the walls of the city, trying to terrify them so it would be easier to capture the city. So this was a psyops campaign. That's what we call it today, psychological operations. They were, even back then, engaging in psychological operations, trying to demoralize the people so that they would have an easier time going about defeating them. These officers talked about the God of Jerusalem as though he were one of the pagan gods made by human hands. And that there's a footnote after Hebrew there. Let's go down and where's my cursor? I can't find it. There we go. Let's go down and look at that footnote. Yeah, in the dialect of Judah, but yeah, that would be Hebrew. So, then King Hezekiah and the prophet Isaiah, son of Amoz, cried out in prayer to God in heaven, and the Lord sent an angel who destroyed the Assyrian army with all its commanders and officers. So Sennacherib was forced to return home in disgrace to his own land. And when he entered the temple of his God, some of his own sons killed him there with the sword. Now, of course, both the accounting kings and this account makes it sound like Assyria went home and Sennacherib went home in defeat, and as soon as he got home, his sons killed him. Well, that wasn't the case. I think you'll find that Sennacherib actually ended up outliving Hezekiah, but it did eventually happen, and it is true that his sons killed him, and those two sons fled, and his son Esarhaddon took his place. That is how the Lord rescued Hezekiah and the people of Jerusalem from King Sennacherib of Assyria and from all the others who threatened them. So there was peace throughout the land. From then on, King Hezekiah became highly respected among all the surrounding nations, and many gifts for the Lord arrived at Jerusalem with valuable presents for King Hezekiah too. About that time, Hezekiah became deathly ill. He prayed to the Lord, who healed him and gave him a miraculous sign. Now that's two sentences to cover a lot of text in 2 Kings and in Isaiah, because that part of the story is also retold in the book of Isaiah. But Hezekiah did not respond appropriately to the kindness shown him, and he became proud. So the Lord's anger came against him and against Judah and Jerusalem. Then Hezekiah humbled himself and repented of his pride, as did the people of Jerusalem. So the Lord's anger did not fall on them during Hezekiah's lifetime. Hezekiah was very wealthy and highly honored. He built special treasury buildings for his silver, gold, precious stones, and spices, and for his shields and other valuable items. He also constructed many storehouses for his grain, new wine, and olive oil. And he made many stalls for his cattle and pens for his flocks of sheep and goats. He built many towns and acquired vast flocks and herds, for God had given him great wealth. He blocked up the upper spring of Gihon and brought the water down through a tunnel to the west side of the city of David, and so he succeeded in everything he did. Now it's interesting that the post-exilic Jews who compiled these accounts would put this in here without recognizing what Isaiah had to say about it. However, when ambassadors arrived from Babylon to ask about the remarkable events that had taken place in the land, God withdrew from Hezekiah in order to test him and see what was really in his heart. And we know from the other accounts that, well, he went and showed them all his wealth, and that got stored up in the minds of the Chaldeans, the ambassadors from Babylon. At that time, they were still subject to Assyria, but they came, and so when they did take the ascendancy, then Judah was a high-level target because they knew there was a lot of wealth there for them to go plunder. The rest of the events in Hezekiah's reign and his acts of devotion are recorded in the vision of the prophet Isaiah, son of Amoz, which is included in the book of the kings of Judah and Israel. Well, that looks to me like it's very explicitly referencing the other books in the Old Testament. But we know that these things also frequently reference books that are not found in the Old Testament. When Hezekiah died, he was buried in the upper area of the royal cemetery, and all Judah and Jerusalem honored him at his death. And his son Manasseh became the next king. And we understand that there was an overlap, that Manasseh and Hezekiah ruled together for a period of time. And, you know, the scholars have figured out how long that is roughly, but anyway. Chapter 33. Manasseh was 12 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 55 years. So that made him the longest reigning king. The second longest reigning king, Josiah, reigned for 52 years. So Manasseh put on 3 years on top of that. Although, again, recall that Manasseh was only 12 when he became king, so he was not as old as Josiah when he died. But still, because he had that period of co-regency, his reign ended up being longer. He did what was evil in the Lord's sight, following the detestable practices of the pagan nations that the Lord had driven from the land ahead of the Israelites. He rebuilt the pagan shrines his father Hezekiah had broken down. He constructed altars for the images of Baal and set up Asherah poles. He also bowed down before all the powers of the heavens and worshipped them. He built pagan altars in the temple of the Lord, the place where the Lord had said, "My name will remain in Jerusalem forever." He built these altars for all the powers of the heavens in both courtyards of the Lord's temple. Manasseh also sacrificed his own sons in the fire. Footnote A will say the Hebrew says literally caused his sons to pass through the fire in the valley of Ben Hinnom. He practiced sorcery, divination, and witchcraft, mysticism in other words, and he consulted with mediums and psychics. He did much that was evil in the Lord's sight, arousing his anger. Manasseh even took a carved idol he had made and set it up in God's temple, the very place where God had told David and his son Solomon, "My name will be honored forever in this temple and in Jerusalem, the city I have chosen from among all the tribes of Israel. If the Israelites will be careful to obey my commands, all the laws, decrees, and regulations given through Moses, I will not send them into exile from this land that I set aside for your ancestors." But Manasseh led the people of Judah and Jerusalem to do even more evil than the pagan nations that the Lord had destroyed when the people of Israel entered the land. The Lord spoke to Manasseh and his people, but they ignored all his warnings. So the Lord sent the commanders of the Assyrian armies, and they took Manasseh prisoner. Now, here's an element of the story that we didn't read in the book of Kings and that you won't find in the book of Isaiah. None of the rest of the story that we're about to read here is there. And we've hinted at this in the past, that we're going to see how the post-exilic Jews, as they recounted their history, put a different emphasis on things. And I'm not saying these things didn't happen. I'm sure they did. But it's the emphasis that the writers put on things, and the gatekeeping functions that they do. And maybe I need to explain briefly what I mean by gatekeeping functions. The media in our modern world has a gatekeeper function. The editors and reporters at these institutions decide what news stories are important and what should be presented to us. And they've got a whole world out there to report on, or a whole city out there to report on, with lots and lots and lots of things going on. And they establish some criteria that they think will be useful to their audience and will attract the people to them, because they make money when they have people paying attention to their content. So they want to attract readers and viewers and listeners and so forth. So that's part of their, but they're doing a gatekeeping function. They're, to some extent, deciding the public agenda simply by what they choose to cover. And there may be an important issue in town, and it doesn't capture the people's attention because the gatekeepers don't think it's important and don't report on it. So it doesn't attract much attention. And so there's a sense in which the writers of these books that made it into the Old Testament are also performing a gatekeeper function. And the authors of 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings made different choices in their gatekeeping than did the post-exilic Jews who prepared the accounts here in Chronicles. So the Lord sent the commanders of the Assyrian armies, and they took Manasseh prisoner. They put a ring through his nose, bound him in bronze chains, and led him away to Babylon. And secular history confirms for us that this was a practice of the Assyrian kings. When they found one of their vassals, such as Manasseh, who technically was subject to them, being rebellious and not behaving as they thought he should, they would send an army and go take him captive. But rather than take him all the way to Nineveh, they take him to another city that they control, just to separate him from his own land. So in this case, they bound him up and led him away to Babylon. Now, here's the part of the story that definitely doesn't get mentioned in the books of Kings. But while in deep distress, Manasseh sought the Lord his God and sincerely humbled himself before the God of his ancestors. And when he prayed, the Lord listened to him and was moved by his request. So the Lord brought Manasseh back to Jerusalem and to his kingdom. Then Manasseh finally realized that the Lord alone is God. Well, okay, the Lord does move to protect those who observe him, and the Lord may have had something to do with this, but it may also have been that the Assyrians at some point felt like Manasseh had learned his lesson. If he changed his mind about God, he might also have changed his mind about his suzerainty covenant with the king of Assyria, and they may have believed that he would be more compliant, and therefore they would let him go back to Jerusalem and resume his role there, assuming that he would be more compliant with what the Assyrians wanted. But the Lord, again, may well have had a hand in seeing to it that that decision got made. So now Manasseh's back in Jerusalem. After this, Manasseh rebuilt the outer wall of the city of David from west of the Gihon Spring in the Kidron Valley to the Fish Gate, and continuing around the hill of Ophel. He built the wall very high, and he stationed his military officers in all the fortified towns of Judah. Manasseh also removed the foreign gods and the idol from the Lord's temple. He tore down all the altars he had built on the hill where the temple stood, and all the altars that were in Jerusalem, and he dumped them outside the city. Then he restored the altar of the Lord and sacrificed peace offerings. Whoops, not scrolling what I wanted to scroll. And thanksgiving offerings on it. He also encouraged the people of Judah to worship the Lord, the God of Israel. However, the people still sacrificed at the pagan shrines, though only to the Lord their God. Now, who you sacrifice to is largely based on the image you hold in your mind of the God that you worship. Because ultimately, it is what's in your mind as you worship that determines what God you worship and what effect that worship then will have on you. The law of worship, you become like that you worship. So even if you consider you're worshiping the Creator, if you have a faulty image of the Creator in your mind as you worship, your worship won't have the proper effect because of that faulty image. So, yes, they're sacrificing at the pagan shrines. They're not coming to Jerusalem, though only to the Lord their God. In other words, at least outwardly, they're saying this is to the Creator, to Yahweh. The rest of the events of Manasseh's reign, his prayer to God, and the words the seers spoke to him in the name of the Lord, the God of Israel, are recorded in the book of the kings of Israel. Probably not the book of Kings we're familiar with, but another book. Manasseh's prayer, the account of the way God answered him, and an account of all his sins and unfaithfulness are recorded in the record of the seers. Footnote B, the record of Hosea. Not a name we've ever run across otherwise. In fact, let me see what it says here in the NIV about that. There's no such footnote. Oh, yes, it is. One Hebrew manuscript and the Septuagint. Most Hebrew manuscripts say of Hosea. So, yeah, that's why the difference there. When Manasseh died, it includes a list of the locations where he built pagan shrines and set up Asherah poles and idols before he humbled himself and repented. When Manasseh died, he was buried in his palace. Then his son Amon became the next king. Now, he reigned for 52 years. Amon was 22 years old when he became king, so he would have been born roughly the 30th year of his father's reign. So Dad was 42 when Amon was born. He did what was evil in the Lord's sight, just as his father Manasseh had done. He worshipped and sacrificed to all the idols his father had made. But unlike his father, he did not humble himself before the Lord. Instead, Amon sinned even more. Then Ammon's own officials conspired against him and assassinated him in his palace. But the people of the land killed all those who had conspired against King Amon, and they made his son Josiah the next king. Now, he was 22 when he became king. He reigned for only 2 years, so he was only 24 when his officials conspired against him and assassinated him. His son now takes his place. Well, he had a son when he was relatively young, as we're about to see. Josiah was 8 years old. Subtract 8 from 24, you get 16. Josiah was 8 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 31 years. 8 and 31 is 39, and he did not die a natural death, as we know from having read the books of Kings. He did what was pleasing in the Lord's sight and followed the example of his ancestor David. He did not turn away from doing what was right. Now, before I read on here, let me just point out, and we've said this several times in the past, but just make sure we're aware of it. That story about the repentance of Manasseh is not told, as we've noted, in the book of Kings, nor is it told in the book of Isaiah. We only read it here. And that supports our contention that the authors are trying to sort of whitewash the record of the kings of Israel. Manasseh was a bad king. And it's likely, I think, that the authors of the books of Kings, the prophets, didn't mention it because it involves such an insignificant portion of Manasseh's reign. It may have only been the last couple of years of his reign. Now, there are people who suggest, and this seems likely, that Manasseh was able to have an influence on his grandson, that by the time he repented, his own son, Amon, was fully set in his ways, and Manasseh wasn't able to change his mind, but he was able to have an influence on his grandson, Josiah, who would become king just 2 years after Manasseh's death. That seems likely. So Josiah had a reason to follow the Lord, and he had some influence from his grandfather to lead him in that direction. During the 8th year of his reign, now he's about 16, while he was still young, Josiah began to seek the God of his ancestor David. Then in the 12th year, another 4 years, so now he's 20, he began to purify Judah and Jerusalem, destroying all the pagan shrines, the Asherah poles, and the carved idols and cast images. He ordered that the altars of Baal be demolished and that the incense altars which stood above them be broken down. He also made sure that the Asherah poles, the carved idols, and the cast images were smashed and scattered over the graves of those who had sacrificed to them. He burned the bones of the pagan priests on their own altars, and so he purified Judah and Jerusalem. Now, you have to understand the significance of this. Altars were designed to bear animal sacrifices. If human bones were burned on them, that defiled them, and they were no longer clean. And this must have been a pagan thing, because Josiah does this to pagan altars, and the pagans won't use them because they've been defiled, because human bones were burned on them. So, now it doesn't say this, but it is likely that, like previous kings of Judah, the pagan priests whose bones he burned on them met their demise at the hands of the king's army, or his executioners, his enforcers, and that's how their bones came to be burned on those altars. But then in the minds of the people, this purified Judah and Jerusalem, because now the people would not use these defiled altars. He did the same things in the town of Manasseh, Ephraim, and Simeon, even as far as Naphtali, and in the regions all around them. He destroyed the pagan altars and the Asherah poles, and he crushed the idols into dust. He cut down all the incense altars throughout the land of Israel. Finally, he returned to Jerusalem. In the 18th year of his reign, 8 and 18 is 26, after he had purified the land and the temple, Josiah appointed Shaphan, son of Azaliah, Maaseiah, the governor of Jerusalem, and Joas, son of Joahaz, the royal historian, to repair the temple of the Lord his God. They gave Hilkiah, the high priest, the money that had been collected by the Levites, who served as gatekeepers at the temple of God. The gifts were brought by people from Manasseh, Ephraim, and from all the remnant of Israel, as well as from all Judah, Benjamin, and the people of Jerusalem. So recall that the people of the northern kingdom got resettled by the kings of Assyria in other lands. But apparently there were people from those tribes that fled Sennacherib into Judah and were defended when God defended Judah. And so now they're there, and they're able to take part in these ceremonies as led by Josiah. As well as from all Judah, Benjamin, and the people of Jerusalem. That would be the southern kingdom. He entrusted the money to the man assigned to supervise the restoration of the Lord's temple. Then they paid the workers who did repairs and renovation of the temple. They hired carpenters and builders who purchased finished stone for the walls and timber for the rafters and beams. They restored what earlier kings of Judah had allowed to fall into ruin. The workers served faithfully under the leadership of Jahath and Obadiah, Levites of the Merarite clan, and Zechariah and Meshullam, Levites of the Kohathite clan. Other Levites, all of whom were skilled musicians, were put in charge of the laborers of the various trades. Still others assisted as secretaries, officials, and gatekeepers. Now, we get to the part of the story that we read in the books of the Kings. While they were bringing out the money collected at the Lord's temple, Hilkiah the priest found the book of the law of the Lord that was written by Moses. He found the Pentateuch, or the Torah. Hilkiah said to Shaphan the court secretary, "I have found the book of the law of the Lord's temple." Then Hilkiah gave the scroll to Shaphan. Shaphan took the scroll to the king and reported, "Your officials are doing everything they were assigned to do. The money that was collected at the temple of the Lord has been turned over to the supervisors and workmen." Shaphan also told the king, "Hilkiah the priest has given me a scroll." So Shaphan read it to the king. When the king heard what was written in the law, he tore his clothes in despair. Then he gave these orders to Hilkiah, Ahikam son of Shaphan, Achbor son of Micaiah, Shaphan the court secretary, and Asaiah the king's personal advisor. "Go to the temple and speak to the Lord for me and for all the remnant of Israel and Judah. Inquire about the words written in the scroll that has been found. For the Lord's great anger has been poured out on us because our ancestors have not obeyed the word of the Lord. We have not been doing everything this scroll says we must do." Now, right here, we see some precedent to the parable quoted later in the book of Ezekiel. Ezekiel chapter, it's not 16, I'm pretty sure, but let's see if I can find it. See, Ezekiel comes before Daniel.
When in this representation of God's character, if we look at it through the lens of our culture,
And look at what through the lens of our own culture?
he had them read the scroll, and I don't remember. I've already forgot.
Well, he said that God's anger was powerful against them because they hadn't obeyed him. They hadn't done the things that the thing said they were supposed to do.
Yeah, God's angry, so he's going to zap them, and they're blaming God for the consequences that they're going to have to suffer.
Yeah.
As if it's God that's gonna bring it about.
And here's another thing that I wanted to point out here in verse 21. Let me reread it. "For the Lord's great anger has been poured out on us because our ancestors have not obeyed the word of the Lord. We've not been doing everything this scroll says we must do." There's a bit of push the blame off myself. It's our ancestors that have done this. Now, I want to read this passage from Ezekiel. You've probably heard me say this before. It's Ezekiel 18. "The word of the Lord came to me. What do you people mean by quoting this proverb about the land of Israel? The fathers eat sour grapes, and the children's teeth are set on edge." And he goes on, and this is the passage where it says, "The soul who sins is the one who will die." In other words, the natural consequences of your actions fall on the people who do the actions, not on other people. Now, why would the people say that? Well, we get a clue about it here. During the days of Manasseh, the people had in fact gotten a little away from worshiping God as specified in the books of Moses. So there was a belief that there was wickedness. Now, those books also say, we read it in the books of Kings, that Manasseh caused a lot of bloodshed in Jerusalem. Now that sounds like a pretty bad indictment, but look back at the story of King David. Remember that time that he lined the people of another nation out in groups on the ground and measured them off in thirds, and 2 of the 3 groups were killed, the other group was made slaves. There was a lot of bloodshed then. There was a lot of bloodshed in David's life. So how does that differentiate Manasseh from David? Well, there may have been a perception by the prophets of who got killed. David only killed the people who deserved to be killed because of the way they had lived. That's a frequent human justification for our homicidal activities. We kill somebody, well, I didn't kill anybody who didn't have it coming. You've probably heard people say it that way. And so they make that distinction. Well, bloodshed is bloodshed. A human being dies. You have taken something that you can't give back. You're not the creator. You can't give life. So you shouldn't be taking it, because you can't undo it once you do it. And it doesn't matter who it is. We need to learn to leave those kinds of things to God and let God take care of them. Now, granted, we understand that God allows humans to set up government and criminal justice systems in order to put a check on the spread of wickedness on this broken planet. And so we do not say that shouldn't be done. We just pointed out that it's not God's ideal. So anyway, but we see there that very sense that gets reported here in Ezekiel, that, our ancestors were bad and now we're suffering the consequences, rather than recognizing what we are doing that is causing these bad things to happen to us. So Hezekiah and the other men went to the new quarter of Jerusalem to consult with the prophet Huldah. She was the wife of Shallum, son of Tikvah, son of Harhas, the keeper of the temple wardrobe. Now, this language becomes a little bit complicated and difficult to understand, because we've just named Huldah, Shallum, Tikvah, and Harhas. And one of those people is the keeper of the temple wardrobe. Now, I think you'll find most interpreters assume that the keeper of the temple wardrobe is Huldah's husband, Shallum, son of Tikvah, son of Harhas, but it was Shallum who was the keeper of the temple wardrobe. There were two footnotes there. Let's see what they say. Okay, the footnote C, the new quarter, the second quarter, a newer section of Jerusalem. The Hebrew reads the Mishnah. And then for B, as in the parallel text of 2 Kings 22:14, the Hebrew reads son of Tokath, son of Hasra. But again, none of that clarifies who was actually the keeper of the wardrobe. I would suggest that, as we have discussed in the past, in those days when people could become kings simply by killing the existing king, you didn't put people in positions of in administrative and other trust positions, particularly with your food, but in other ways in charge of things, unless you trusted them. So the keeper of the temple wardrobe would have had to been someone that was trusted in order to take this. So that made him a prominent and trusted person. And his wife now is a prophet. We sometimes say prophetess, but a prophet is a prophet. She was a prophet. She said to them, the Lord, the God of Israel, has spoken. Go back and tell the man who sent you. This is what Yahweh says. I am going to bring disaster on this city and its people. Footnote E, this place. All right. All the curses written in the scroll that was read to the king of Judah will come true. For my people have abandoned me and offered sacrifices to pagan gods, and I am very angry with them for everything they have done. My anger will be poured out on this place, and it will not be quenched. Well, let's read that with an understanding of what God's wrath really is. We know from other passages that God expresses his wrath by giving us over to the natural consequences of our choices. In the book of Romans, chapter 1, it says, because people didn't respect God, because they didn't accept him as the creator, did not worship him as the creator, then God gave them over to whatever it was they wanted to do, and they ended up being inflamed with passion for each other, giving up the natural use of women, and being inflamed with lust for one another, etc., etc. God gave them over to this. He let them receive the natural consequences of their choices. He let them do what they wanted. That was how God expressed his wrath. So in this case, and the prophet words it in accordance with the culture of the times, God's wrath is coming on Judah. He is going to give them over to the natural consequences of the choices they make. And as we read on, we'll see that they became arrogant. They became overconfident. And by acting this way, they brought down on themselves the wrath and violence of the surrounding nations. And I know you. I know you're stubborn and hard-headed, stiff-necked, sometimes is the language used in the Old Testament. You won't change your mind even as these things happen to you. And therefore, the consequences won't change, and my anger will not be quenched. But go to the king of Judah who sent you to seek the Lord, and tell him, this is what Yahweh, the God of Israel, says concerning the message you have just heard. You were sorry and humbled yourself before God when you heard his words against this city and its people. You humbled yourself and tore your clothing in despair and wept before me in repentance. And I have indeed heard you, says the Lord. So I will not send the promised disaster until after you have died and been buried in peace. You yourself will not see the disaster I am going to bring on this city and its people. So they took her message back to the king, and we know that that took place. Now, that doesn't mean he didn't see disaster, because he did something foolish and went out and got himself injured, fighting somebody he should have been leaving alone. But let's read on and find out. Then the king summoned all the elders of Judah and Jerusalem, and the king went up to the temple of the Lord with all the people of Judah and Jerusalem, along with the priests and the Levites, all the people from the greatest to the least. There the king read to them the entire book of the covenant that had been found in the Lord's temple. The king took his place of authority beside the pillar and renewed the covenant in the Lord's presence. He pledged to obey the Lord by keeping all his commands, laws, and decrees with all his heart and soul. He promised to obey all the terms of the covenant that were written in the scroll. And he required everyone in Jerusalem and the people of Benjamin to make a similar pledge. The people of Jerusalem did so, renewing their covenant with God, the God of their ancestors. Now, blanket mass conversion like this doesn't count for much, and it doesn't make permanent change. The old saying is that a man convinced against his will is of the same opinion still. The king decrees you do this, so you do it, but that doesn't mean you agree with it. That doesn't mean you accept it in your mind. Now, I'm not saying that there weren't people whose minds were changed by the edicts of Josiah. There probably were some, maybe even quite a lot of people, but not everyone. And that's why we see the people reverting to their old ways so soon after Josiah's death. So Josiah removed all detestable idols from the entire land of Israel and required everyone to worship the Lord their God. And throughout the rest of his lifetime, they did not turn away from the Lord, the God of their ancestors. This is chapter 34. I don't remember. I think we've got maybe 2 more chapters, and I'm looking here. We've only got about 10 more minutes. We'll see how far we get. Then Josiah announced that the Passover of the Lord would be celebrated in Jerusalem. And so the Passover lamb was slaughtered on the 14th day of the first month. He didn't do it a month late like his great-grandfather had done. Josiah also assigned the priests to their duties and encouraged them in their work at the temple of the Lord. He issued this order to the Levites, who were to teach all Israel and who had been set apart to serve the Lord. Put the holy ark in the temple that was built by Solomon, son of David, the king of Israel. You no longer need to carry it back and forth on your shoulders. Now spend your time serving the Lord your God and his people Israel. Report for duty according to the family divisions of your ancestors, following the directions of King David of Israel and the directions of his son Solomon. Then stand in the sanctuary at the place appointed for your family division, and help the families assigned to you as they bring their offerings to the temple. Slaughter the Passover lambs, purify yourselves, and prepare to help those who come. Now remember that in the ceremony of the Passover, every family, probably a larger group, every family was to sacrifice its own lamb and then to eat the roast flesh with bitter herbs and unleavened bread. So there would be a lot of Passover lambs brought to the temple to be sacrificed. Purify yourselves and prepare to help those who come. Follow all the directions the Lord gave through Moses. Then Josiah provided 30,000 lambs and young goats for the people's Passover offerings, along with 3,000 cattle, all from the king's own flocks and herds. The king's officials also made willing contributions to the people, priests, and Levites. Hezekiah, Zechariah, and Jehiel, the administrators of God's temple, gave the priests 2,600 lambs and young goats and 300 cattle as Passover offerings, so that the Levites, the priests, would have their own offerings to present for Passover. The Levite leaders, Conaniah and his brothers Shemaiah and Nethanel, as well as Hashabiah, Jehiel, and Jozabad, gave 5,000 lambs and young goats and 500 cattle to the Levites for their Passover offerings. When everything was ready for the Passover celebration, the priests and Levites took their places, organized by their divisions as the king had commanded. The Levites then slaughtered the Passover lambs and presented the blood to the priests, who sprinkled the blood on the altar while the Levites prepared the animals. They divided the burnt offerings among the people by their family groups, so they could offer them to the Lord as prescribed in the book of Moses. They did the same with the cattle. Then they roasted the Passover lambs as prescribed, and they boiled the holy offerings in pots, kettles, and pans, and brought them out quickly so the people could eat them. Afterwards, the Levites prepared Passover offerings for themselves and for the priests, the descendants of Aaron, because the priests had been busy from morning till night offering the burnt offerings and the fat portions. The Levites took responsibility for all these preparations. The musicians, the descendants of Asaph, were in their assigned places, following the commands that had been given by David, Asaph, Heman, and Jeduthun, the king's seer. The gatekeepers guarded the gates and did not need to leave their posts of duty, for the Passover offerings were prepared for them by their fellow Levites. The entire ceremony for the Lord's Passover was completed that day. All the burnt offerings were sacrificed on the altar of the Lord, as King Josiah had commanded. All the Israelites present in Jerusalem celebrated Passover and the festival of unleavened bread for 7 days. Now, see, they're doing it at the right time and for the right amount of time for 7 days. You may recall that in Hezekiah's time, they actually added another week to it. Never since the time of the prophet Samuel had there been such a Passover. None of the kings of Israel had ever kept a Passover as Josiah did, involving all the priests and Levites, all the people of Jerusalem, and people from all over Judah and Israel. This Passover was celebrated in the 18th year of Josiah's reign. Now, 18 from 31 leaves about 13 more years for him to rule. After Josiah had finished restoring the temple, King Necho of Egypt led his army up from Egypt to do battle at Carchemish on the Euphrates River. And Josiah and his army marched out to fight him. Now, King Necho of Egypt was coming up to help the king of Assyria fight the king of Babylon. Babylon was about to take over and defeat Assyria. And Assyria was looking for help, and King Necho came to do it. And what possessed Josiah to think he should go out and fight Necho still escapes me to this day. I don't know what he was thinking. Doesn't make any sense to me at all, but he did it. It says, but King Necho sent messengers to Josiah with this message. What do you want with me, King of Judah? I have no quarrel with you today. I'm on my way to fight another nation, and God has told me to hurry. Do not interfere with God who is with me, or he will destroy you. But Josiah refused to listen to Necho, to whom God had indeed spoken, and he would not turn back. We will take it with a grain of salt that God literally sent Necho to fight Babylon. That doesn't make particular sense, but that's what the prophets thought. So they're saying, yeah, God did talk to Necho. Instead, he disguised himself and led his army into battle on the plain of Megiddo. But the enemy archers hit King Josiah with their arrows and wounded him. He cried out to his men, "Take me from the battle, for I am badly wounded." So they lifted Josiah out of his chariot and placed him in another chariot. Then they brought him back to Jerusalem, where he died. He was buried there in the royal cemetery, and all Judah and Jerusalem mourned for him. The prophet Jeremiah composed funeral songs for Josiah, and to this day choirs still sing these sad songs about his death. Now, this day would be post-exile, so this is a tradition that has lasted for some time. Jeremiah, by this time, is long gone. These songs of sorrow have become a tradition and are recorded in the Book of Laments, not the Book of Lamentations, although some of it may have been included there. The specific laments about the death of Josiah are not included in the Book of Lamentations, which scholars believe was in fact written by Jeremiah. And so Jeremiah was active, at least at the end of Josiah's reign, and that's why we said in our sermon presentation a couple of weeks back that the prophet Zephaniah may have been a little bit older than Jeremiah, because he prophesied during Josiah's reign, and the first reference we have Jeremiah is at the end of Josiah's reign. The rest of the events of Josiah's reign and his acts of devotion, carried out according to what was written in the law of the Lord from beginning to end, are all recorded in the book of the kings of Israel and Judah. And I'm looking at our clocks, and it says we're close to the end of time here. As far as I can tell, we have one more chapter in the book of Chronicles. The fall of Jerusalem, Cyrus allows the exiles to return. So there's one more chapter. So I'm going to say that let's not take time. It means we'll actually get into Ezra, and we'll conclude 2 Chronicles as we get into Ezra next week, as we continue reading through the Old Testament here on our Friday night Bible study. So we hope that what we've covered here has given you a glimpse of God's goodness compared to human stupidity sometimes, human stubbornness, our own brokenness, that no matter what craziness we get into, God is still faithful, and he is still committed to the promise he made in Eden after the original two humans bought into the deceiver's lies. And he made a commitment at that point to restore the broken human race. And it's taken a long time as we humans view it. But God is faithful to his promise, and he is still at work to restore and redeem the human race and to bring it back into the condition in which he created it, where he wants us to be. And it is our privilege, simply by our own choice, to become part of that healing and restoration. There is no barrier that any other being, demon or human, can put in our way that can keep us away from God. The only barrier that can keep us from God is our own choice. You've probably heard that before. Just thought I'd make that point. We will be back again next week to continue going through the Old Testament and talking about these things. We invite you to join us again. And so until then, we say goodbye and God bless.